So just before we start again, Chris, I just want to say that I'm going to introduce Chris as I was going to introduce Fadescha, and I'll reintroduce Fadescha when she comes on back later on, is going to do a talk which comes out of his early relationship with the curators, ruangrupa, where he suggested a notion about which we called lacking ambition. And it's what, in a sense, made ruangrupa come even nearer to them rather than fending them off. And it's quite an interesting story that I'm sure he will share a bit later with us. But Chris Cozier has been around a long time, like all of us, an artist, writer, and curator, who aims to explore and affect conventional readings of the Caribbean. And even in our recent conversation, his informed notions based on writings by people like C.L.R. James, the Trinidadian historian and journalist and socialist, who was the voice of Pan-Africanism, not only in the Caribbean, but also in Britain and Europe, brings a completely different reading of the fluidity of Caribbean culture and its power to negotiate within shifting narratives. And it's from these interpretations that he draws to make many of his own personal works, which also are installation-based, video-based, practices which investigate both the historical as well as the current experiences of understanding a wider contemporary world, where Chris is involved with, and here he's speaking also on behalf of Alice Yard, which is an art collective which began in 2006, based in Port of Spain in Trinidad and Tobago, which organizes numerous artists' projects, exhibitions, performances, often on particular ethoses of self-determination, self-efficiency, communal spaces, and as well as on mass camps, which is very specific to Trinidad's carnival bands and how they work through masks and costumes. So I'm going to leave it now to Chris to sort of talk about his work. Also, Alice Yard, which is he works quite closely with the architect Sean Leonard, the artist, the writer and editor Nicholas Lolin, as well as designer Kristen Chen. And I want to say I'm very, very grateful for Bruce Keon to have allowed us to use the sign, which is behind me and is everywhere in Vienna at the moment. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Shaheen, and thanks to everyone for inviting me to participate in this conversation. I was pleasantly surprised. Just as I got up to go and get a glass of water, I saw that Bruce had also produced a sign for party office. So it seems that we're learning more and more about each other and finding more and more common interests. How to begin to talk? I suppose I should really begin by talking a little bit about Alice Yard myself. It's very hard for me sometimes to talk about Alice Yard because it's not a singular conversation. You know, and even my own practice as an artist, which I'm not really talking about, even though Alice Yard is an extension of my practice as an artist, because it's an exercise in context building, in generosity, in a sense, world building. Because, you know, when people talk about places like the Caribbean, they always talk about it in a tragic sense. Oh, it's becoming so, it's becoming this, and it's becoming that, more commercial, more developed. But actually, we're not becoming more of anything that we haven't been all along. I mean, the Caribbean is, you know, a very bizarre sort of outpost, sort of labor camp of European kingdoms that evolved, ironically, during the Enlightenment. So, so it's not that we're becoming shrewd, it's that that's where we began, you know, in the kind of a product of a colonial enterprise, a criminal product, where human beings were transported there as property and so forth. And then when they left, you know, we then had the problem of building a society and learning how to become human. But we had been delivering that message all along, you know, by damaging factories, by even jumping off the ships that we didn't want to come here. It was a kind of human act because we knew we were crossing our boundary into something that, you know, we had nothing invested in, you know, ontologically, physically, mentally, you know. So anyhow, to cut a long story short, Al-Asyad is an ongoing response to that question. Like, why are we here? And what can we say to other people in the industrial complex that are searching for a way ahead, or a way of being that doesn't remain extractive, violent, acquisitive, and shrewd. So it's, I mean, it sounds soppy, I suppose, but, and that's why the idea of ambition comes up, because of course, when people form organizations like this in places like this, it's normally to go grant hunting, to seek approvals, you know, institutional approvals. And these things can happen. You can get money, you can get institutional approval, but nothing changes in your particular social environment. You know, relationships stay the same, conditions stay the same. So, you know, so we kind of, this is an exercise in sort of epistemic sovereignty, which we got from one of our early thinkers, Lloyd Bess, and that's why we used the sign, "We are the people too," because we thought that that sign epitomizes something about the problem of jumping into the public sphere as artists, as thinkers. Because just to call yourself an artist or a thinker in a colonial or neo-colonial space is in some ways an act of resistance. So when the invitation to be part of Documenta came, we were quite confused because we were seen as a bunch of slackers. You know, we're not writing any grants, you're not looking to form parts of any things to run down money, because, you know, we thought we just accomplish what we can with what we have, because we were trying to build relations to our community. These shrewd Caribbean societies are very aggressive about creative things or creative enterprises, you know. And I mean, someone of my generation, I come from the generation where, you know, your parents made you into doctors, lawyers, you know, and all kinds of weird things, that because they felt these things were necessary for the development of the country. But what is this development about in a certain way? So anyhow, and we found that people needed, and based on the mass camp, which I can explain, the mass camp is where a kind of popular yard, kind of, you know, yards evolved in Port of Spain as a city. Once people came out of the plantations after slavery into the urban areas, and there were places of collective living, and where people washed clothes, dreamed, fought, imagined, and the carnival space, production space, is a space where people get together, not so much in an industrial way, but they get together and spend time together, making things together, sometimes not always sure what the final whole project will be. But people, when this guy comes, you have a skill, you bring it to the table, you know, and it adds to another skill and another skill. It's, you know, people, in a sense, they're like schools. But of course, coming out of colonial societies, they're not recognized as such. So we live in these societies where there's that old-fashioned dichotomy between formal and informal learning. So in the 2006, after doing other experiments in sort of more conventional art spaces, trying to build white boxes, trying to get a group of us, suddenly found ourselves needing a place to hang out. Artists wanted spaces to do things. And Sean Leonard, my colleague, said, "Oh, let's use my grandmother's, great-grandmother's backyard, because people always came there to do things, you know, and she would provide food, and the family, you know, relatives, different artists, different people came there. It was a kind of point of gathering." So it wasn't even an avant-garde idea, or some alternative idea. We were really digging into something that was quite traditional and conventional. The yard space is almost archetypal in terms of stories of settlement, and how urban space is organized in the Caribbean. And it's not surprising that the yard as a concept was transplanted into London, sometimes negatively. I mean, the association with words like yardie and so on. But it really comes from these collective sites where people, in a sense, are off-site spaces in between. Because in the Caribbean, in their variations, I know in Trinidad in particular, there are lots of laws and things about idling, loitering. In other words, if you're just sitting on the side of the road, it means you're not occupied, working for the grand industrial project, But of course, in these spaces in between are where we imagine. So Alice Yard is one of those spaces off-site, where we don't really have a purpose. But how is purpose defined? Purpose is defined as working for the big project, right? So with that said, when one of the people in the documenta committee first approached Alice Yard, I was, I thought, oh God, somebody writing me to write another report, a recommendation, because as an artist, as a writer in the past, I used to do these kinds of reports, for different organizations about what's interesting, what they can fund and that kind of thing. So I thought, I'm not going down that tunnel again. And I actually didn't really take it on for two reasons. One, I mean, I didn't think documenta was, despite the Ockway intervention of years ago, I still felt very far away from things like that, Documenta was something that grumpy people somewhere in Germany, grumpy old, did, so and I know I have friends from Germany and they say, oh, we love the days when boys planted those trees. That was a real documenta. So I didn't feel it was it felt very remote and alien to me, And so then suddenly they said, no, we have to meet, we're thinking we got to invite you and so on. I mean, I was fascinated by ruangrupa. I'd heard of them, I read about them, but it's like on the other side of the planet, And then I said, but no, you can't talk to me alone. You've got to talk to the whole group. So we had a meeting with one documenta, one or two documenta representatives and some, and Andan, I think it was from ruangrupa, and lots of back and forth. Are you interested? Are you not interested? We're thinking about you. What is your process? But this is in the middle of COVID. Everybody was really tired. I was fed up. And at a certain point, I just looked at them and said, guys, we have no ambition. In a sense, we're not auditioning for anything. We do this. We've been doing this for years, whether anybody is looking or not. And, or whether anybody is willing to fund us or not. We're just doing it because, that's what has to be done in a context like ours with our particular history. So there's the four of us, Kristen Chan, Sean Leonard, myself, and Nicholas Loughlin. As you can see, I'm already dashing out of the frame. And so I said I had no ambition. And then a couple of months later, when we were formally invited, and it was a really funny moment. I said I had no ambition. And I think Andan asked me if we like fishing. So it was a moment of kind of mischievous absurdity, because in a later conversation with Andan, which is online, I said, the sufficiencies in the future. So, but with that said, there is a contemporary vocabulary and bodies of work in the Caribbean that inspired me as a young artist. So what you're seeing is a sample of artists a little older than myself in working in conceptual ways in the early 80s. This is a nationalist mural that was destroyed from the 60s. And so, these are different things that I think stimulated me, an early example of folkloric illustration. So these are things that stay in my mind as I proceed to become an artist myself and work out why a space like Alice Yard is needed as a lab for experimentation and so on. So what did we do for documenta? We decided we'll just do what we always do. for the last, 15 years, and which is to support the interests of artists who want to try something that they don't know if it will work. They don't know if it will have any commercial value, but they just feel compelled. And because we live in such a shrewd society where people are not interested in anything that doesn't generate a quick exchange or, or can't become a commodity in some kind of way, these gestures that we support, experimental gestures, sort of like a kind of parallel discourse or critique to or of the things that are taking place in the society. And very often the artists that commit these gestures, when they do them, they're quickly forgotten or dismissed because they can't be converted into commodities. And because the Caribbean is supposed to live on the other side of history, history happens in other places. And we are the places where people escape from history, which is quite ironic because history began in the Caribbean, the history of the Western Industrial Project. You could say that the plantation system of the Caribbean is the kind of, is the first, it was on the road towards the Anthropocene. It was also the birth of kind of industrial global capitalism. And it's also a kind of rehearsal for very ugly things that happened in Europe, like, the things that the Nazis did, to people of Jewish descent, or gay people or whatever, so there's a kind of way that the Caribbean is a place where the experience, the historical experience of arriving up as property, becoming subjects of kingdoms, citizens of possible republics, is a long journey. And that kind of itinerancy and that kind of shifting across different boundaries sort of informs how we see the world. So we decided we would just invite different artists to come to Kassel, and we would host them for, a couple of weeks. They'll do a project. Sometimes it's a revival of a project they did with us in the past. Sometimes it was a new project. And then the show would be organic, because as each new artist came, a new work would manifest. And each artist leaves, he would leave his or her work in the hands of the next artist. And then each artist would sort of curate and organize the space to see how their work could fit into this dialogue. And we had 4 domiciles in there, so that we were actually living and working and producing the art in the space. And then there were some fascinating moments, where Sophia from Puerto Rico decided to open the walls. Some of the walls were moved because Sean, being an architect, we experimented with the space. And so she sat in her bedroom looking at her own video work and the work of other artists that we selected. And then people were invited to sit and join her looking at the videos. So we kind of breached notions of public. And by the way, Shaheen had said to me for this context that there may be images in here that, some people might be a little disturbed by, coffins and sort of bloody mechanical monsters and stuff like that. So I should have forewarned people. Please excuse me if I didn't. That was a work by Ebony Patterson, an early work of Ebony Patterson, where she spent a couple of days with us in the around 2011, where she made a coffin for every person that was shot, every young person that was shot during the 9 days she spent with us in Port of Spain in 2011. Because of course, a lot of young people are, killing each other in the kind of desperation or that is going on in some of these societies. But it's not a desperation of poverty so much. I think it's just something that comes from the origin of these societies in which Black bodies are expendable. And the purpose of being here is to plunder people and resources, so that if the political class does it, then of course, on the street level, it exacerbates. So the rise of gun violence and gang violence in the Caribbean, has nothing to do with misguided youth as it has to do with the poor example being set by a political class that has inherited a rapacious model, because we were a colony much longer than we have been, you could say, a sovereign independent state. You can't change values overnight. If you had 300 years of plunder, 60 years of independence isn't going to change that overnight. So we use this space as a space to process. It's a lab for ideas, collaboration, investigation, improvisation, and so forth. So here it is. We arrive at Documenta. We have all these artists in the space coming and going. We subdivided the time because none of us individually could stay there for the full time. We invited artists to act on our behalf. And we had people coming from Denmark, like Michelle Eistrup. She had a couple of things she was doing. She transferred her operations from Copenhagen. She's of Jamaican origin, and she lives in Denmark, and she transferred some of her operations to our space for 2 weeks. And the list is there, it's online, you can see it. And we proceeded. What no one told us is that the chaos that ensued, because we thought we were coming to a global event. We were naive enough to think we were coming to an international event. International in a real way, in the sense that, it's people from different collectives in different parts of the world. But as soon as people arrived, people were shaking their fingers at us. And suddenly we were being accused of things that we had nothing invested in. I mean, how can you look at somebody that comes from a part of the world that where you arrived as property, not even people? How can you be accused of discrimination? I mean, it just defies all logic. So we found ourselves in a really, we felt we were invited under false pretenses. So anyhow, but it was our objective to do what we always do, whether anybody cares, is looking or not. So when we arrived in Kassel, that is what we did. And the purpose of Documenta really was not to impress museums and critics and curators in a normative sort of art fair model, not to create new commodities or distractions for the global art market, but was to find commonalities with people in other parts of the world. And that, to me, that was the most successful thing. I met artists from places that I never thought I would meet. I say, our group had conversations that made me rethink a lot of things, and really fascinating affinities. Like in Trinidad, we have a term liming, which is how people get together and lime and socialize and share ideas and laugh or just look out at the world from the pavement. And I was pleasantly surprised that nongkrong means the same thing in Indonesia. And it's a kind of way of living off plantation, because we had laws about idling and loitering. And then, of course, there was the very concept of lumbung, which in the Caribbean we call gayap, So, we were troubled at some points, because lumbung deals with the concept of a commodity, and Alessiad is not, we're not sort of keeping and subdividing a commodity as the community that shaped lumbung does. But because what we are really about is creating a space for creative imaginings. It's much more abstract, it felt, but again, it was, so like in this image you're seeing here, I brought Versha Harris, Tessa Mars, Razia Barsati, artists from Haiti, Suriname, and Barbados together in Kassel to talk about their relationship to folkloric things and self-reevaluation and self-reformation, which I think a lot of young women artists in the Caribbean gravitating to, and younger generations are relating to the folkloric in different ways. And yeah, and so the experience for me, as far as I was concerned, and Alessiad was concerned, we really enjoyed that communal sharing, because we felt in some way that we weren't alone, that there were other people in other parts of the world embarking on similar enterprises, and we could learn from them and they can learn from us. So that really left us with a lot to process. So we didn't really jump in to a lot of the sort of political arguments that were taking place there, because we felt that those were local arguments, and that if this was a real global event, then this was a minor distraction. Now, of course, I mean, Germans wouldn't like to hear that. They have the money, and it's their event, and they have their own anxieties, right? But these anxieties are not relevant to the vast majority of people living out on the rest of the planet. And especially, you know, I mean, I'm no expert in Middle Eastern politics, but I mean, it seems that everything was being muddled when we got there. It's like anti-Semitism was being muddled with, what people may feel about Israel as a state. I don't know if they're, and Judaism as a religion, I don't even know if they're the same, in the sense of what we see happening when we look at the news now. And when you're talking to people that come from colonial environments, there's no question about how, how we perceive these events. And it wouldn't be the same as people that carry the burden of Germany's very particular and unique history. Well, not Germany alone, but Europe's in general. So we didn't feel invested in that argument because we're not looking to have futures there. We're kind of more concerned about the development of our own societies and what we have learned from being on the other side of these kinds of experiences. So yeah, I mean, I don't know what else I could say other than I listened to some of the conversations that took place after documenta. And one of the most fascinating for me was one that was, I think it was a Scottish art historian called Charles Esch that suggested that, very provocatively, that, there was a moment of realism, a moment of modernism, and now there's lumbung. And I thought that very provocatively interesting, because I mean, we are still processing what we went through in the context of the whole experiment, but we never got distracted by the manipulations of the media, the negativity, the hierarchical negativity that was coming from the German establishment. We focused on why we were there, which is to find affinities with people and collectives in other parts of the world, to see what we can learn from their responses to their histories, what are the connections between our respective histories, and what are the solutions, to widening the narrative of what constitutes a practice, art practice, and that it isn't all centralized on, getting into art fairs and the value of value, So while I'm saying all of this, you're seeing works by many of the artists. This is a project by Shannon Alonso, a young artist from Trinidad, And the writing on the text is Creole from a song, from a chant, what they would have called a chantuelle, called Zingue, which is about stick fighters and women and their arms interlocked when they marched on the streets in Port of Spain during the Cambole riots in the 1880s, I think. And then you're seeing images of Aliciard at night with artists doing different things. I think this was an artist that came from Haiti. Yeah, and you know, these are just different images of different people doing different things in our space. And over the years, I don't know, should I stop here? You know, and wait to find out if Vidisha is kind of caught themselves, or maybe open it up to the floor if people have any questions about the images they're seeing. Because I mean, I think there's a lot of images coming at you all. You're seeing things from Good School in Documenta. You're seeing things from 1,000 Mocos in Port of Spain, which is stilt workers. You're seeing exhibitions that we have supported. I know Shaheen had a particular interest in Versha Harris's installation at the Grimmwelt.
Yeah.
It passed before our eyes suddenly. For that project, I was just very interested in a new generation's interest in the folkloric and how it was being used, and the kind of meeting point between the folkloric and the Disneyfication and the kind of deconstruction of that. And I really didn't realize that the Grimm Brothers Museum was in Kassel until I got there to do a site visit for Documenta. And when I saw it, I thought of this work by Versha and said, yes, I want to have this piece in there. And the museum agreed. And then I invited these other artists to have a conversation with her, which we recorded, and we hope we will transcribe at some point. You know, so there were many different gestures. There was something that just passed, a lino block of a footprint by Belkis Ramirez, one of the pioneers of the contemporary Caribbean art world, who passed away sadly a few years ago. And she had gifted that lino block to Aliciard because she so enjoyed what we were doing and so on. So we thought we would carry that footprint to Documenta. So, you know, so to posthumously present her in Documenta, which I thought was a really fascinating thing to, you know, to do. And of course, yeah, so I'll throw the floor open to any questions and different things that you all might want to, while we wait to see whether Vidisha can join us or not. And but I am open to listening to questions from the floor.